Okay, thanks for coming. You guys might remember that I mentioned that I was working on an African-American cemetery just outside of Houston, where we were trying to discover who was buried there, and we were also trying to compile some stories, some small little stories about their lives. And I don't know why this is not moving. There we go. And I was frustrated because, sorry, there was a delay. I was frustrated because I thought there has to be more to the story. I'm only finding them in records after 1867, which is the first time you really see African Americans named in census records, or we found them in voter registration. And so I just felt like there had to be a way for us to link the African Americans living in the censuses in 1870 and beyond to the slaves, the unnamed slaves living in the slave schedules, found in the slave schedules in 1850s and 1860s. So that was my next project, was to link formerly enslaved individuals to their slave owners, to link them to their own family members, to discover as much as possible about their lives and their origins, and then to add them to the family tree, and so that we could add notes and validating sources for their families to find. Some of the challenges are that African Americans or enslaved people were considered property, and so they are not named in census records before 1870. They rarely knew their actual birth dates or ages, so it was tricky. Like later census records, it's hard they don't always match up because they didn't really know their ages. And identifying the family connections between them was hard because they weren't permitted by law to marry, and some slave owners would let them, but most would not let them marry. Also, women were made to have children with multiple partners. So it's kind of hard to have family groupings that are easily identifiable. Also, once they were freed, they sometimes chose surnames that you don't know why they chose it, or it was unpredictable, or it changed over time. So what we knew at the start was that there were thousands of unnamed African American slaves, unidentified, in the slave schedules. We also knew there were thousands of African Americans free living in 1870, and that there were various records where slaves were named under their slave owner names. But what we didn't know is exactly how to connect them. We believed that if we just started somewhere, hopefully some ideas and inspiration would come, and sure enough, it has. So our starting place was the 1870 census. We decided to add everyone from a specific precinct in the area to the family tree on Family Search. And that would allow us to then search for records for them and build their family trees. So we chose a specific precinct based on the fact that there was a large plantation in the area. Well, there were several, but the one we decided was one we wanted to look into was the Greenwood plantation. And so we created a spreadsheet for the 1870 census where we copied and pasted each page from that precinct to the spreadsheet. And that would allow us to organize the data and order it in different ways. So here's what the actual 1870 census looks like. And we added the people line by line to the family tree, and then we made notes on Family Search and on the spreadsheet about any connections that we could see or possible connections. So here's our spreadsheet, an example of how we did that. We had copied and pasted everyone over, and then we added their Family Search PID number. And then we would make notes if they might have been a slave from the Greenwood plantation. Based on, when we had made these notes, it was based on the fact that their last name was the same as Greenwood. His name was Greenwood. And so about 20 to 30% of slaves ended up taking the names of their slave owners, at least for a while, and sometimes they changed it. But so we would make note of people with that same last name or living close to his family. This is just an example of how we could order and organize the spreadsheet based on last name, based on birth date, based on birth year. Next, we wanted to discover who the slave owners were. So previous slave owners, I should say, in the slave schedules. So in 1870, we looked for white heads of households. Here is Greenwood, the owner of the Greenwood plantation. So this is the slave schedule, and this shows the Wood family all living close to each other with the number of slaves they owned. As you can see, slaves are not named. It just has their age, their sex, and their race. Keep in mind on slave schedules, a lot of times the slave owners were known by the first initial and surname. So going back to that, you can see you just have W.B. Wood or G. Wood. So sometimes you have to look at regular censuses to see and compare to the neighbors and try to just see if you can figure out who that person actually is. Takes a little detective work. We made sure we built their trees as well, because theirs is the trail we're trying to follow back through time to see how the slaves got here. So we need to build the slave owner trees. And then we also made note of any neighbor connections that we could see in 1870 and made sure we kept those notes on our spreadsheet and on their person pages. We did create a spreadsheet for the slave schedule, where we could gather lots of information like interactions between slave owners, the property that they owned, because all of that could help us link slaves to slave owners. So going back to our 1870 spreadsheet, you can see where we have made notes in our notes column that Greenwood was a slave, his son was a slave owner, his son was a slave owner, here's his wife. Greenwood had died by this census. He died a few years before, but we're making notes of family members knowing that they were a slave owning family. I also see that they had Black neighbors on both sides. And so I wanted to see if I could figure out if these people were possible former slaves. So I made notes of possible connections on the Collaborate tab of Family Search. That is huge for me. Very few people use it. I love it because you dig into something and you come up with connections, but then if you don't write down how you came up with that connection, you forget it and you move on, and then nobody else knows why you have someone connected. So I tried to make copious notes under Collaborate tab. So now I wanted to go find more records where slaves were named owned by Greenwood. So I went to the county records and typed under Greenwood, found lots of records, one of which was a mortgage record. And in this mortgage record, there are tons of slaves named. One of them was Daniel. I know he had they had a neighbor back up in the 1870 census named Dan. That's not like enough to say, but there is a Dan there. So I thought, let me go back to that census and see who's living on the other side of the Wood family. And when I go back to that, I see there's a Smith Barnes and Sylvia Barnes from Alabama, which is where Green came from right before 1850. And so I go back to that same mortgage record where I saw Daniel, and I find a Sylvie and I find a Smith. And so these are not proof, but I'm just gathering my evidence, right? So there's a good indication there. Next, I wanted to go see what I could find in wills. See, that's another place where slaves are named attached to slave owners. So I wanted to go search for wills under Greenwood's name. I was able to find a will from Greenwood's mother, where she willed a small Negro girl named Farabee to her grandson. I also found a will where Greenwood's wife willed a Negro girl, Rose, to their daughter. And so using these wills, and these are examples, there are many others, I go back to that same mortgage record and I find Farabee and I find Rose. Working with other community organizations and other people who have similar goals is super key in this work, because you all think differently, you come from a slightly different angle, but it's super, super helpful to collaborate together. And I was led to the Portal to Texas History, where there is a collection of plantation account books for Greenwood Plantation, which is basically a gold mine of information. And as I have poured through those account books, I have been able to find that Greenwood wrote down families, groupings of his slaves with their birth years and their names. And so that is absolutely amazing. There's Faraba, and her son is Daniel, those two slaves that we already saw named. We were able to create a spreadsheet for the Greenwood Plantation, and we love this spreadsheet. It has so much information on it where we have these families grouped together. And so we have been able to go from an unidentified 35-year-old Black female slave to Faraba on Family Search, where she has 6 sources. We have notes in collaboration. We have memories with photographs of documents where she's listed. And so that is very gratifying. More importantly, we have a family tree with family connections. And this is just part of her tree, one branch of her tree, but it is amazing to be able to see that and watch it grow and work on that. All the records that we use to connect the dots between slave and slave owner and these family connections were census records, the slave schedules, those 2 slave schedules, county records, wills or probates, and the plantation account book, which was amazing. But even if I hadn't found that, there were still so many connections we made. Again, I just stress to work with other people, value the unique ideas and contributions that they can make, and then utilize as many different records as you can find to create a fuller picture. So if you have any questions or you want to help, please feel free to ask away.